Hello, class. Today we're going to discuss Mike Hannes's article on the virtues of acknowledged ecological dependence. Now, to get at Hannes's argument, we need to talk a bit about the concept of autonomy. Autonomy as a word comes from ancient Greek. You can break it down into two parts. Auto, meaning self. So you think an automobile is something that is mobile on its own. It doesn't need something outside it to push it along. And nomos generally means law, like a literal legal statute, but it can also mean more generally governance or political control. So autonomy, autonomy, is literally just self-governance or self-control, being the thing that controls what you do and how you move. Autonomy does not play a big role in ancient Greek ethical thought. Now, being a free person as opposed to being enslaved plays a very big role in ancient Greek political and ethical thought. But autonomy as its own source of value is not a big part of Greek ethics. It becomes a really big deal in the early modern period. This is largely in response to the publication of Newtonian mechanics in terms of physics, right? There's supposed to be laws that govern how all the particles in the world move. And for a lot of philosophers, that led to a challenge. If there's these laws of nature and they explain how everything moves, how could anyone or anything be autonomous? How could you be a self-mover? Aren't you just moved by the laws of nature, same as anything else? So clearly we're butting up against questions of free will, which we're not going to try to deal with in this class. But what's important for our purposes is that in this early modern period, where you get Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, and someone we're going to talk about in particular, Immanuel Kant, there's a notion of autonomy as self-control as a value, right? And it is considered unqualifiedly good. It's always good without exception, and it's also considered to be an ultimate good. So more of it is always better than less, and there's nothing that is ever worth trading any autonomy for, right? So if you think, look, diamonds are very valuable, but there is some amount of gold that is worth trading for some amount of diamonds. The idea here would be that autonomy is so valuable that there's nothing else of value that would ever be worth trading. It would never be worth losing some amount of autonomy to gain any amount of anything else. Kant clearly believes this, but there's other early modern philosophers that are in a similar vein. And we also see this in Regan. Now I need to flesh that out a bit here, right? Kant and Regan disagree about what beings have autonomy. Kant thinks that rationality is what gets you autonomy, and so only rational beings can have autonomy. And then he builds his entire ethical system out of the idea that you can know what you ought to do morally by just understanding what's involved with respecting other people's autonomy, their right to self-legislate or to make laws for themselves, and them respecting your right to make laws for yourself or control your own movement. Regan doesn't think that rationality is what matters, but he does agree that autonomy matters. And both Kant and Regan think that autonomy always goes hand in hand with this unqualified, irreplaceable intrinsic value, a kind of value that cannot be equaled, let alone surpassed. And that's why autonomy for Regan is still a good theoretical ground for rights, where, as we've seen over and over again, rights are trump cards. Right? The idea here is if rights come from autonomy and there's nothing that you would ever rationally trade autonomy for, then there's nothing that would ever rationally weigh as much as the rights that sit on autonomy. So that's how you get rights as trump cards, by tying them to a valuable that is irreplaceable. And we've seen that's what Regan does when he argues for animal rights as opposed to mere concern for animal welfare or anti-cruelty or other views like that. Now, so that's common to most deontological theories. From a virtue ethical perspective, autonomy is something that can be valued too little or too much. So we know from Aristotle that there's this notion of the doctrine of the mean, that anything of value, you can value it too much or too little, and both of those are vices, or you can value it the right amount, and that's going to be in the mean, in the middle between the vice of excess and the vice of deficiency. So virtue ethics, more contemporary virtue ethics, looking back to Aristotle, but then applying it to people like Kant, they say, whoa, 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 you're saying autonomy is of value, and we agree, but you're saying that autonomy has this value that you can never value it too much? That doesn't sound right. That violates the doctrine of the mean. So for a virtue ethicist like Hannes, he's going to say the virtuous character state is going to value autonomy, but neither too little nor too much. And now it's easy to imagine what it would be to value autonomy too little, right? That would be to just be okay with being ruled by outside forces. Kant calls this heteronomy, where hetero means other and nomi again means control or legislation. So heteronomy is being ruled by laws that other people make for you, and whereas autonomy is being ruled by laws you make for yourself. So it's easy to see that you could value autonomy too little if you're just okay with heteronomy, if you're okay with other people telling you what to do all the time, and you have a sort of go with the flow, you don't really stand for anything or care about anything enough to really stick to it, that would be a vice of deficiency, sure. But where Hannes and other virtue ethicists are going to disagree with the Kantians is they're going to say there's also a vice of excess, valuing autonomy too much, which could be a sort of arrogant self-sufficiency, right? Saying, oh, I don't need other people, I don't need anyone or anything outside of myself. I am completely self-governing, and I can get everything that I need to live a good life all on my own. That, for a virtue ethicist like Hannes, sounds like arrogance, which is itself a vice, and it's also an excessive valuing of autonomy. It's saying, someone that takes that perspective is saying the right way to value autonomy is to value it so much that you would sacrifice any other thing for it, and that's excessive, right? We want autonomy, but we want it in balance with other good things in life. So the virtue that involves valuing autonomy enough but not too much is going to be aware of. It's not going to deny or disregard all the ways in which all creatures, including humans, including autonomous beings, are dependent and interdependent. We need relationships with others. So again, this excessive maniacal focus on autonomy tries to say, I don't need anyone or anything. If I need it, I can get it for myself. I don't need help ever. A virtuous valuing of autonomy is going to say, I'm in control of my own life. I make my own decisions, but I make those decisions in a context of connections with other people who are dependent on me, and other people whom I have been dependent on in the past and maybe dependent on again in the future. And if I'm going to live a good life, I need those relationships. And that doesn't threaten my autonomy. It actually gives it the appropriate place. So if that's the right view of the value of autonomy as such, then the virtuous character state is going to be one that makes people respond appropriately to that value. It's not going to promote arrogant self-sufficiency, or we're less worried about this, but it's also not going to tell people, just go with the flow, don't have any value commitments, right? That would be the deficiency, but really the people we're worried about are people that try to oversell autonomy. Now, on this virtue ethical perspective, valuing autonomy rightly is a balancing act, right? On the one hand, you could allow yourself to be defined by things like your culture, your family, just social norms. That would be to not care about self-creation or self-control enough. Another way of messing up the valuing of autonomy is to effectively not have a character at all, in that you just play at being committed to this or that or whatever. That would be another way of not really being self-controlled, right? If you're going to have a self that controls things, you need to have commitments, things that you are committed to. So if you just let other people tell you what to value, or you fail to really value anything, those are both going to be bad ways to live. Those are not going to be conducive to flourishing, because you're not really living your own life. Now, this is obviously true when we're talking about your life being defined by others. But if we just do a little digging, I want to clarify why Hannes claims, and I think claims rightly, that a life where you have no character at all is a life where you're not truly in control of yourself. You don't even really have a self. So the idea here is that without developing a psychological identity, there's no unfolding narrative of your life. Right? There's just a series of disconnected events. Right? So-and-so was born on May 31st, and so-and-so took their first steps on whatever date a year and a half later. Those are just snapshots in time. What make them really you is that they form a narrative that starts with your birth, or maybe starts before that, depending on your view of other philosophical questions. But it, in any case, continues across time and organizes these things. But for you to have that kind of self, you're going to have a character. You're going to have reliable dispositions to respond to certain situations in certain ways on the basis of your value judgments. But character can't just be dislodged at will, right? Once you train yourself to be a kind individual, it's not just easy to intentionally be cruel, or even to turn your back on someone who needs help and just disregard them. So having a character requires having these constitutive connections to other things, people, places, and also values, right? So to the Kantian, this could look like a lack of autonomy. If you're a sentimental person who they see someone that needs help and they just think, oh, I feel bad, they need help, I'll go help them. Kant actually thinks that's a form of heteronomy, being controlled by your emotions, and that's bad. Instead, you should be someone that just makes a cold, rational judgment that this person has value and they need help, therefore I have a duty to provide help to them. The character focused view is going to say, no, you've made yourself a kind, compassionate individual by living a certain life. And now that you're a compassionate individual, it's not up to you to just turn that off like flipping a switch. So having an identity, being a self, is going to require that you have connections to things outside your own control. Nobody develops character in a vacuum. And so nobody is going to have a self that without having these connections. But there's more than one way that you can fail to really have a self, right? One is by letting other people make those connections for you, in which case they aren't really yours, right? So if you're wanting to go to Harvard, but you realize that it's because your parents have just instilled in your mind the idea that Harvard is the only university worth going to on the planet, right? You could have this moment of almost disassociation where all of a sudden you think, look, I know Harvard is a good school, but is it really me that wanted to go there? Or is it just, my parents having constructed this view that it's the only school worth going to, right? If it's not really you that made that value judgment, then it's not really helping yourself to have that connection. But another way of failing to have a self is to not have any connections at all out of a fear of loss of control. So someone, for instance, who said, I'm not going to get a dog because if I care about the dog, well, then that could be used against me, right? This is going to sound like the plot of some bad action movie, but if someone was like, oh, well, I'm not going to have kids because if I have a kid, they could be kidnapped and that could be used to blackmail me to do something, and I don't want to lose control that way, right? That's someone who has wildly out of control fear of connection to anything outside themselves, making them weak, right? Giving people something to hold on to in trying to force them to act one way rather than another. What Hannes is going for and what I'm trying to emphasize here is that's not a good way to live, right? You might be worried about staying in control of yourself, but if you're so worried about that you are unwilling to have children just because your children could in principle be threatened and that could be used to push you this way or that, you're actually undermining your ability to have a self, because you only have a self when you have connections to other people, other things, things that you make value judgments about and therefore have commitments to. So if you're going to live a flourishing life, you have to have these commitments, and that is going to put certain weak spots in your psyche, right? Things that people could press on. But that's not a failing, that's just part of the human condition. So in articulating this view of autonomy that I've been laying out here, Hannes is really taking cues from a famous 20th century philosopher named Alasdair MacIntyre. MacIntyre famously argues that we've been falsely drawn to exclusive focus on our rational nature. And this is very much an attack on Kant, who's the most popular version of this in contemporary philosophy. But it's also an attack on other historical ethical figures. What's important to MacIntyre is to say, yes, we are rational animals, we human beings, and rationality is morally important. So far, so good. But where he's going to differ from Kant and the Kantians, and where he's going to differ from most views, is that he's going to say equally important are two other sides to our human nature. One is that we are dependent, and one is that we are animals. Right? So ultimately, we are dependent, rational animals. And it's only when we understand all three of those things in the context of one another that we arrive at an understanding of what it is to flourish. So the Kantian conception of autonomy wants to make us completely independent, and it wants to completely ignore our animal side, or see it as something that would be heteronomous, something that would interfere with our self-control. MacIntyre says, no, you want to be a self, you want to have autonomy, but you need to understand that what it is for a creature like you and me to have autonomy is to have the kind of self-control that fits with being a dependent, rational animal. Having an animal side that gives you emotional responses, and having dependencies, things that you need and can't necessarily provide for yourself. Once we understand dependency and its role in flourishing, right, then we can see, on one hand, it's about giving and receiving, right? So dependency is really a matter of interdependency, right? Now, it may be that one person is dependent on another and not vice versa, but if you look at the wider web of human beings, then we all form a sort of interconnected network where everybody needs somebody and sort of goes around in spirals and or like a spider web spreading out, connecting one person to another to another. So that is more complicated than a simple reciprocity type of interdependency. With simple reciprocity, we just keep track of debt and credit, and we make sure that the ledger evens out, right? So everyone is taking their turn at taking care of other people. So an example here, we might say, I hate the cold, you hate the heat. So you and I make an agreement that you'll shovel the snow from my sidewalk and driveway in the winter, and I'll mow your lawn in the summer, right? So I do something for you, you do something for me. There's nothing wrong with that kind of reciprocity, right? We need that in the complex society that we live in. But if we really want to live flourishing lives in a community of interdependent beings, MacIntyre thinks we need to move beyond this picture of keeping a ledger of favors done and favors owed. What we need is for people to trust each other to do their fair share in terms of helping out, and we also need other people to be trustworthy in that they have a character that makes them prone to do their fair share without someone watching them and breathing down their neck all the time. And when I was making this slide, I couldn't help but think this is a common feminist point about men, women, and housework, right? Most people, or maybe I shouldn't say most people, but many people rightly think that in a heterosexual couple, the man and the woman should roughly equally split the housework, right? That's a sort of egalitarian ideal. There's not too many people that think that in principle the housework should be the woman's work anymore. But even when you look at people who claim to believe in this egalitarian ideal, if you look at the way they actually live their lives, statistically, empirically, women still get stuck doing a lot more of the housework, even when both members of the household are working. And even if the woman has the more demanding job, she also still ends up doing more of the housework on average. So there's a feminist point to make here about virtue, which is that having a good romantic relationship shouldn't involve a ledger where you closely keep track of who's doing what for whom all the time. But if you can't count on both members of the couple to take it on themselves to do their fair share, then you might have to fall back on that ledger picture. So many heterosexual couples don't actually have an egalitarian distribution of the housework. And the ideal resolution would be for guys to come to realize they're not doing their fair share. Again, we're talking on average, so there's exceptions. Don't get worked up if you are one of these exception cases, right? But on average, men are not doing their fair share, and the virtuous thing to do would be to realize that you're not doing your fair share, and then to be motivated to fix that on your own, so that your partner doesn't have to breathe down your neck or constantly remind you, hey, it's your turn to take out the trash or to do the dishes, right? If you can't get to the virtuous state, then maybe the next best thing is a chore chart, which is essentially a ledger, right? Where you say, okay, this is who's going to do what job on what day of the week. But better than that would be a genuinely reciprocal, interdependent family unit where both members of the couple just want to do the housework, in the sense, not in that you necessarily get great joy in cleaning out the cat litter pan, but in the sense that you just want to be a contributing member of the relationship. And that moves you where you otherwise might not be motivated to do things like doing the dishes or cleaning the cat litter pan. So now let's talk about virtuous autonomy and acknowledging our dependence. The character virtue with respect to this interdependence is a state, at least Hannes and I think MacIntyre would agree with this, it's a state of simultaneously fulfilling your own responsibilities without expecting direct compensation and graciously accepting assistance from others, recognizing and acknowledging that you are not self-sufficient, or even that if you could be, right, if you could uh, parachute out of a plane into the middle of a forest and live as a hermit, building your shelter from the ground up and catching your own food, right? Even if you could live that way, it wouldn't be as good of a human life as the kind that's available if you make yourself dependent on others to a degree. So virtue is going to be wanting to do your own jobs and graciously accepting help when other people help you, and graciously helping other people do their jobs, so that basically everyone's helping everyone. Hannes is a fan of this concept of acknowledged dependence, this MacIntyre-ish idea that each of us is a dependent animal, and so we're going to have these connections with one another. But as an environmental ethicist, Hannes wants to expand this out and say, can we extend the concept of acknowledged dependence to our relations to nature as a whole? And what would the moral landscape look like if we do go ahead and extend our acknowledged dependencies to environmental factors as well. So this is where we add the environmentalist aspect, and we get Hannes articulating what he calls acknowledged ecological or environmental dependence. Right? So MacIntyre emphasized individual flourishing for social animals. Hannes extends this by saying flourishing also only exists, for at least for the kind of creatures that we are, in the context of a functioning, resilient ecosystem that has what it needs to maintain integrity over time. So not only do we need interdependent humans and interdependent non-human animals, we also need interdependence between humans and plants, or you could even think of this as a callback to Leopold a little and talk about an interdependence between humans and the land. Though Hannes, I think, is speaking even more broadly about interconnected ecosystems, plural, and the way they maintain integrity over time. So the idea is that we exist not just as nodes in a social network of other humans or more broadly other animals. We live in an ecological network, and that network is itself part of a system of other such networks. And none of us can live well, at least for very long, unless we contribute to the maintenance of our own ecosystem, and at least indirectly to the maintenance of all the ecosystems that form, I guess, really the biosphere as a whole. What Hannes is after here is the idea that just as you can fail to value personal autonomy enough because you let others run all over you, you can also fail to value your ecological dependence and interdependence if you fail to see yourself as an agent capable of contributing to the overall functioning of the ecosystem. That would be the individual equivalent of saying, well, I'm not in control of anything, I'll just let others make all my decisions for me. That's an individual failing, but there's also an ecological failing if you say, I'm just a victim of the system, nothing I do can matter, so I'll give up on even trying. Alternatively, just as you can fail in the individual case by valuing personal autonomy too highly and thus typo there, it should be turning, not turning, turn. So you can fail by turning your back on others, right? Refusing to help or even to accept help when you need it. There's an ecological parallel, which is failing to see yourself as responsible for contributing to the good functioning of the ecosystem. Right? So just like someone who claims, oh, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, nobody ever did anything for me, I'm a self-made man, right? They're really ignoring all of the ways that society as a whole is constructed to help people achieve their goals. You could also be sort of environmentally blind to the way that the ecosystem itself and the biosphere more widely also contribute to the very possibility of you making decisions about how to live your life, and the way that your dependence on the ecosystem really puts you in a kind of debt, right? Not something that we necessarily want to put in a ledger, but there's something that you should want to pay back constantly, that you should just want to do your part in maintaining a functioning ecological system. So let's step back now and talk about personal virtue and personal flourishing, and then flesh out more of how that connects to environmental ethics. We've seen environmental virtue ethics connects individual flourishing first to other humans, right? Your flourishing impacts my flourishing and vice versa. And then it expands beyond that to interconnections with the natural world, connections which make it impossible for the individual to flourish if they are destroying or degrading the natural world because they're connected to it. This is the kind of thing that we saw Hursthouse trying to bring out as she tried to turn Taylor's notion of respect for the value of life into a virtue as opposed to just an all-encompassing value. So we've already seen Hursthouse style environmental virtue ethics make these interconnections between self and environmental health. So we can say that virtue and flourishing require recognizing, acknowledging, and upholding the value of the natural world. Why? Well, because it makes living our distinctly human lives possible. We just can't live the kind of life that a human is supposed to live that makes life worthwhile for a human without nature doing a lot, providing a lot of resources for us to build our life on. But if you recognize and acknowledge that, no one should have to breathe down your neck, no one should have to twist your arm. If you're a virtuous person, you should just want to do your part to maintain the functioning of that system in a healthy fashion. So this is supposed to be pointing to the way that we do have, as I was putting it when talking about excessive views of autonomy, right? There's sort of a lever here that someone can grab hold of to push you or pull you in a certain direction, right? Namely in an environmentalist direction. But if you have the right notion of autonomy, you shouldn't feel that that's a threat to your selfhood. You should recognize that this handle that someone can use to push you in the environmentalist direction is actually a product of everything that makes you, makes you a person that has a character and has a self. So that's a fundamentally important thing to do, right? The value of the natural world is partially grounded in its role of making the living of a human life possible. And that's a fundamentally important notion to grasp hold of. But that is not the exhaustive contribution it makes. So after arguing for this sort of foundational importance of interconnection between the human and the natural environment, he wants to go on and say there's also aesthetic, intellectual, recreational, artistic, maybe spiritual components to human life that nature also encourages you to develop. Now, adequately relating to these other goods, these other environmental goods, people are going to need further virtues, right? So now we're moving beyond just a focus on acknowledged ecological dependence, right? We can point to things like wonder, which Hursthouse talked about. We can also talk about receptivity, right? Just being attuned to your environment in ways that make you appreciate it. We can talk about aesthetic sensitivity or sensibilities, right? So your ability to find a kind of artistic joy in nature. And there's going to be other virtues as well, right? Curiosity, joyfulness, creativity, maybe even reverence, right? So obviously some people have a literally religious view towards nature. That would make sense of having reverence towards nature. But even if you don't take a literally religious view, you could still have some room for something like reverence, something like, boy, when I think about the grandeur of the Rocky Mountains or the Grand Canyon, or the oceans or the Antarctic, it makes me feel very small, but not in a way that makes me feel like I'm being uh, wiped away, like I'm being turned into a speck of dust. It just fills me with a kind of reverence that isn't it wonderful that there's this huge complex thing, all of which has to keep on spinning just the way it does so that I can go about living my life the way I want to live. That would be a spiritual or quasi spiritual appreciation for nature and the role that it plays in your ability to live a good human life. So let's assume that you're on board with all of this. You think that acknowledged ecological dependence is itself a virtue, and it's also tied up with all these other virtues like wonder and curiosity and maybe reverence. What are going to be some moral vices that stand out when you look at the way far too many people associate with the environment? Well, greed is a very obvious culprit. So we in the affluent West and affluent North systematically learn unhealthy and immoral attitudes toward material goods and their consumption. I think just about anyone who wants to claim to be an environmentalist should agree that Western culture, or more generally post-industrial societies, have unhealthy attitudes towards the consumption of finite natural resources. But there's other traditional vices that this materialistic way of life also inculcates and tries to teach us are virtues, even though they're really vices. So things like pride, envy, intemperance, selfishness, indifference. Right now, I don't think personally that pride as such is a vice. I think pride can be a virtue if, again, we think of it as a neither too much nor too little kind of thing, right? Pride can be a kind of healthy self-esteem or willingness to stand up for oneself, but it's certainly something that you can go overboard with, and then it really does become a vice of thinking yourself too important, not acknowledging that other people have equal value as you, and not acknowledging that other people's lives have equal claim to the resources that are out there. Um, so pride is one of the things that feeds into the massive overconsumption of resources in America, that at a rate that if the rest of the developing world picked up, right, it would just wipe out the world's natural resources really, really fast. Similarly, envy, the idea that, well, if somebody else has something, I need it too, or else I'm falling behind. Right? That is a vice. And yet consumer culture tends to say, oh yeah, you don't have the latest, it's not just enough to have a BMW. Is your BMW more than 2 years old? Oh, well, you're totally falling behind. You should be envious of your neighbor that just bought the newest model of the BMW, right? So that encourages people to overconsume. Uh, Intemperance, right? Just having excessive desires. Traditionally, temperance is related to the desires for basically food, drink, and sex. But let's focus on food and drink here, right? Uh, if it's not enough for you to have enough food to eat comfortably, but you feel that your life is only satisfactory if you have certain kinds of food or drink that are really resource intensive to create, the kinds of things that demand factory farming and other practices that just really extract resources at a an extremely fast rate and leave behind devastated zones of nature, right? That's a vice. And we could go on with selfishness, indifference, and the list goes on and on. So the point is that each of these vices is a unique failing, right? We cash each of them out somewhat differently than the others, but there's a commonality in the way that each of them encourages us to ignore or downplay our dependence. And they also valorize autonomy really beyond all reason, right? So pride says to do what you want to do and to prioritize your own projects over those of others, regardless of the cost. And you can imagine pretty easily how someone could connect that up with autonomy, trying to say, you can't make me, this is a politicized example, but I'm just going to go with it anyway, right? Taxation is theft. How dare you make, I've earned this money. How dare you make me spend it on something that I don't want to by taking some of it as taxes and putting it towards common social goods. That's a violation of my autonomy, right? Well, most any environmentalist or environmentalist friendly view is going to say that's valorizing autonomy beyond all reason. It's taking it to an excess. Or intemperance, right? Wanting too much food and drink, or specifically wanting kinds of food and drink that are really resource depleting, right? That downplays or encourages you to downplay your dependence on the environment, right? It tells you, don't worry about the fact that in 20 years, all the land where that kind of crop is capable of growing will have had all of the nutrients sucked out of the dirt. That's a problem for people that are going to be alive 20 years from now. And I'm sure they'll have figured out some way to fix that by then. So I don't need to worry about it. Right? That is downplaying your dependence on the natural world and thinking that it's okay now to act on these resource gobbling ways of life is really coming out of either thinking that your own life individually is all important, that's over valorizing autonomy, or it's coming from ignoring or downplaying the way that you're going to be dependent on the very things that you're depleting into the future. Or if not literally you, then other people that you care about, at least, or you care about if you're not some kind of a moral monster, right? I suppose there are sociopaths who really genuinely don't have any reciprocal emotional connections. Maybe if you're a sociopath, you really can just drain the environment at whatever speed you want and think, as long as it holds out until I die, that's all that matters. But if you have any kind of emotional or value connections that are going to extend indefinitely into the future, you ought to care about, you ought to be aware of and care about being aware of the rate at which the world's resources are being depleted, because it is going to affect you, or if not you directly, then it's going to affect people that you care about. So can the ecological virtue of acknowledged ecological dependence counteract these consumerist vices, right? That's really the virtue ethical question, right? We're not just doing environmental ethical theory, right? We're trying to think of how to be better environmentalists. Ethics, at least when you're doing virtue ethics, is a practical type of philosophy. It's supposed to tell you how to live or what kind of changes to make to the way you live. So you're not just trying to figure out the truth about what's right and wrong. You're trying to make yourself the kind of person who wants to live rightly and doesn't want to do things that are wrong. So if we teach acknowledged ecological dependence to people, will that actually undermine these consumerist vices, or will it just be, in one ear and out the other, nobody cares? Well, Hannes endorses the picture that we saw from Hearst House, that not only do we need to resurrect the old virtues like uh, temperance and generosity, right? These would be counteractions to greed and to intemperance and so on. He thinks we need at least one new virtue that is specifically environmentalist in nature, which is right orientation to nature. And that orientation brings into view the relationships that partially constitute any given individual in the overall network of the ecosystem. So it makes visible to us all of these connections, and not just visible at a theoretical level, like where you could say, well, yes, I know that what is happening with farmers in Iowa affects my uh, vegetable prices, right? That's a sort of purely abstract, yes, I know the world works that way. This right orientation to nature as a virtue is going to make it seem practically relevant to you. What are we doing with farming practices in Iowa or in India or wherever else? And why are we making those choices? What kind of life does that allow us to live now? And flip side, what kind of lives does it force other people to live, either now or down the line once the resources have been depleted? Right? So at this point, we can zoom into personal relationships. So we can talk about my personal orientation to nature in terms of, uh, do I own any land? And if so, do I take care of it? Or do I encourage my city council to plant trees instead of paving over the local community park? Or we can zoom out to the relations between human society writ large and different ecosystems, right? So what's going on in the Midwest or in the northeastern region of India? What's going on with human societies in those places and the ecosystems that govern those regions? And then we can move back and forth between the personal and the societal and between one region and another until we find a balance, something that allows people to live worthwhile, meaningful human lives without systematically, hopelessly undermining the environment as a consequence. So to conclude, Hannes is optimistic. He thinks that we can find exemplars who show us what virtuous relations to others extended to the natural world looks like. Right? So just as we can find exemplars that show us how one human should relate to another human, we can also find exemplars that show us how humans in general or humans in particular social contexts should interact with and relate to nature. One thing he thinks it's important to emphasize is that we don't need to, and indeed we should not, try to mythologize indigenous societies and try to emulate them, right? So we saw this as one of the anti-colonialist criticisms of deep ecology, the way they sometimes mythologize indigenous peoples as being closer to nature in a way that really undermines their political autonomy or fetishizes them without properly understanding their way of life. Hannes says we don't need to do that and we shouldn't do that, but we can have experts like anthropologists help us get a reasonably clear-eyed and nuanced understanding of different societies, whether they're indigenous societies or just other societies across the world that have different approaches to their relations to nature, relations that are less driven by consumerism and excess focus on autonomy, we can have these experts look at the interconnectedness that those groups manifest with relation to nature. And then we can start to ask ourselves, what would that sort of thing look like in my life and my social network and social world? As long as we can do that, then we've found a virtue. We've found something that we can teach people that will make us reliably better, make us see the world and respond to it with both emotion and action in ways that lead to our own flourishing as human animals and to the flourishing of other humans and non-humans alike. All right, so that's enough on Hannes, his proposal for a new environmental virtue and how we would want to integrate that with maybe Hursthaus's more general environmental virtue ethics framework. I think that's enough for today, so we will stop and we'll pick up with the next video. Thank you all.